Today we have Dr. Jordan Latchler with us, who is a linguist with Sealaska Heritage Institute, and is also in the process of editing and publishing with us the Haida dictionary. So with that, Jordan.
Hello, Sarah. Hadalasis lang wadlawani selu di gudangai la awiyagang yalk ang tanga hinodikyang gayalas gusto di kwalagang di yaklangagang gitskhane lusnagang. Greetings to everyone here. As Sarah said, it's nice to see so many familiar faces and the new faces as well. And always nice to be up here in Juneau when I get the chance. As she said, my name is Jordan Lachler. I've worked for Sealaska for the last, or Sealaska Heritage for the last 7 years, and I've been based in Ketchikan the last 6 years, working mostly on Haida and sort of running the Haida language project from down there. And I'm up here today to talk a little bit about linguistic prehistory of Southeast Alaska. So my goals for the next hour here is to give you guys a little bit of a feel for what it is that linguists do when they're looking at languages and comparing them and trying to figure out if they're related, how they're related, sort of what's the process that we go through when we do that, what kind of things we can find out going through that process, what kind of things we can't find out going through that process, and how that contributes to work done in anthropology and archaeology and other fields that try to give us a better idea of prehistory in general, going back as far back as we can to try to understand how the world came to be the way it is. So that's the first part is we'll talk a little bit about that, give you guys a quick sense of how we do that. But then most of the rest of the talk, I want to talk specifically about here in Southeast Alaska and our three native languages in our region, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, and tell you guys what the research has shown over the last century or so that people have been looking at these languages and trying to figure out what is the linguistic prehistory of Southeast Alaska. That from a linguist's point of view, where did these languages come from? What languages are they related to? How did they come to be where they are and in the way that they are? So that's my main two goals here for this afternoon. If as I go along, if anything is unclear or you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. It's like to keep things informal as we can. So did everybody? Hopefully there was enough handouts for everyone. So we'll just be kind of following along with that. So to start with, talking about how it is that linguists look at languages and try to figure out how and if one language is related to another language. When we say that language X is related to language Y, well, what does that even mean? To a linguist, what that means is that at some point in the past, there was a language spoken by some group of people, and that over time, through migrations and changes and other sorts of developments, that language evolved into language X. Some of the descendants from that original language, those people, some of them now speak language X, and some of them now speak language Y. So there used to be one language, and from that language there's now two. And that's what we mean when we say that two languages are related. That it's not just that they're similar or they've got a lot of words in common or their sentence patterns are the same. It's making a statement saying that we believe, based on the evidence that we've seen and the analysis that we've done, that if we could go back, if we could get in our time machine and go back 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, however far back, we would find a language that is the ancestor, that's the direct ancestor of language X, language Y, language Z. So it's going beyond stating similarities and actually making a claim about real relatedness and making a historical claim of where these languages came from. So very simply, how we do this as a topic, one could easily spend entire semesters talking about the ins and outs of how we actually go about doing this. But for the next 7 minutes, I'll condense all of that. So basically, what linguists do is we look at languages, and the first step is to look for similarities. So we're going to look for words that have similar form, they have like a similar pronunciation, and a similar meaning. Okay. So I've given you some examples there on the first table of, this is straight out of every beginning historical linguistics textbook. Everybody always uses these languages from the Pacific because they work really nicely. So we have the examples for the words for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in several different languages mostly from the Pacific region. So we have Tongan, Samoan, Maori, Rarotongan, Hawaiian, and then Indonesian and Malagasy. So do we have any Tongan speakers in the room? I know there are actually a couple in Juneau, or Samoan speakers. So I'm guessing maybe these languages you may not be familiar with them, but even just looking at the words there for 1 through 5 and comparing them from one language to the next, you can see there's a lot of similarities, right? These words look pretty similar. In some cases, they're identical, right? So the word for 3 in Tongan and Samoan, it's tolu in both languages, exactly the same. In some cases, they're similar, but not exactly the same. So 5 in Tongan and Samoan, nima and lima, not exactly the same, but very similar. And then in some cases, they don't look quite so similar. So for 4, in Tongan you have fa, and in Indonesian you have empat. It doesn't necessarily, at first glance, look like that's also similar. But if we look across these languages and we look at these words, we see that they meet the 2 criteria that would lead us to start to inquire about whether these languages are related. Because we have a bunch of words which all have the same meaning, in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we have words that have very similar form, right? Taha, tasi, tahi, ta'i, kahi, and then satu and irai. So when we find something like that, and this is just looking at 5 words, in reality we would want to look at hundreds and hundreds of words, but we're paring it down for purposes of explanation here. When we find that kind of similarity from one language to the next, that gives us a clue that, okay, something's going on here. There's 2 possibilities, basically. There's two ways that this could have come about. One is that these languages descend from a common ancestor at some point back in time, and that these are the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren languages of that ancestor. Or it could have come about through borrowing, right? So it could have happened that these languages were totally unrelated, came from different families, had nothing to do with one another, but they all happened to borrow these words for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from some language, and so that they wound up all having that same system. Once you start getting large numbers of words, borrowing becomes less and less likely. And the more systematic that you see that the changes are, the less and less likely that borrowing is the answer, and more likely that it's a genetic basis, that these really do come from the same ancestor language. If you look at that first box, right, you can see that, for instance, Tongan and Samoan and Maori, Rarotongan, even Hawaiian look very, very similar to one another. If you look at the Indonesian line, you'll see, for instance, 2 in Indonesian is dua, which is very similar. 5 in Indonesian is lima, which is very similar, in fact, identical to some of the other languages. But then there's other ones that are not the same. So satu, right, the word for number 1, is not as similar as to the rest of them as they are to each other. And the same thing with Malagasy, right? We have irai for 1, but doesn't look like it fits with the rest of them. But roa for 2 looks a lot like rua, and same for 5, right? Dimi, pretty similar to nima and lima. And this tells us, if we were to continue to look at hundreds and hundreds of words and to see this same sort of pattern, what that would tell us is that probably Tongan and Samoan and Maori, Rarotongan and Hawaiian, those first 5, which have more words in common, more words that seem like each other, that those are probably more closely related to each other, and that Indonesian and Malagasy are like more distant cousins. They come from eventually that same ancestor, going back, but they're not as closely related as those other 5 are. And so as linguists, we find a pattern like this, that's when we dig in and we say, okay, I want more than just these 5 words. Give me the whole Tongan dictionary. Give me the whole Samoan dictionary. Give me that Hawaiian dictionary. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to look for as many patterns as I can find. And I'm going to look for consistencies in that pattern. So for instance, if we look at the word for two, right? If we look at that word for two, we're going to see, okay, in Samoan, the word starts with an L, and in Maori, the word starts with an R. So I'm going to see, is that a random thing or is that a pattern, right? Can I predict? Can I look through the dictionaries and see, okay, do words that start in Samoan with an L, do they all start with an R in Maori? And we have at least another example of it there in the word for 5, right? Lima in Samoan and rima in Maori. So it goes beyond just saying, oh, that looks similar, that looks similar, that looks similar, to actually breaking it down and trying to see what are exactly the patterns. L in this language matches up with R in this language. A T in this language matches up with an N in this language. And that's the ideal situation where you can find those consistent patterns rather than just sort of a random similarity between one language and the other. So this gives you an example of what some related languages would look like, looking at 1 through 5. On the second table there, you see what 5 unrelated languages, or languages that we believe are probably not related or only extremely distantly related, look like. So we have Portuguese, we have Hungarian, Hebrew, Cantonese, and Greenlandic, so sort of spanning the globe there. And if you look at the words for 1 through 5 in those languages, you don't see any of the same kind of similarity that you find with Tongan and Samoan and Maori and so forth. So if somebody came to me and said, I believe that Portuguese and Hungarian and Hebrew and Cantonese and Greenlandic all form a language family, they all descended from some common ancestor language back however many thousands of years ago, I would say, but look, what their words for 1 through 5, at least, don't seem to have anything at all in common. And we could go and look at names for animals and names for trees and different things, and we'd see there's just no similarity here, right? So there's really no basis for making that type of claim, where there is a strong basis when we're looking at Tongan and Samoan and Maori, where we have all these commonalities together. So in a certain sense, it's a very common sense kind of approach, and there's lots of details into exactly how you do this, but it's meant to be very methodical and very straightforward and very, very step-by-step. Here's your list of words, here's the patterns that they show from one language to the next, and that's how you really can try to show, yes, language X is related to language Y, or no. We say, nope, I can't find any correspondences, there's no patterns here, language X is not related to language Y. And then that's just looking at vocabulary, and then we can do a similar sort of thing when we get up to sort of higher levels, looking at how words are put together in the languages, how sentences are put together, what kind of sentence patterns you use. So it's not just looking at individual words. You actually do go through the whole grammar of the language, trying to find these types of patterns. And ideally, then, what you can do, if everything works out good and all of your data behaves nicely, what you can do is what we call reconstructing the proto-language. So that based on the evidence from the languages that are in existence now, here in the 21st century, we can hypothesize and make a statement about what we believe that ancestor language to have been. So we can go beyond just saying, yes, they're related, yes, there was some ancestral language there, but we can actually go through and figure out, well, probably in that ancestral language, the word for one was this, and the word for two was this, and the word for three was this. So go beyond just saying that they are related and actually try to reconstruct what that ancient language may have been like based on what the daughter languages are like. So it's sort of like if we had a family reunion, say we were all related, maybe, and we are in some certain sense, but say we were all had some common ancestor from which all of us in this room are derived. It would be as if we would try to figure out, well, what does that person look like, and what were they? Were they tall? Were they short? Were they dark? Were they light? Were they good at math? Or what kind of characteristics did they have, based just on evidence that we have here among us as living people, which is kind of tough if you think about it. And you get a similar sort of difficulty trying to do that for languages. So that's, in a very quick nutshell, what linguists do, or at least those linguists who pursue this field of sort of historical linguistics, trying to figure out how languages are related and where they fit with one another. But specifically now, turning to our languages here, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian, we want to see, well, what does the research show us? So people have been doing this kind of historical linguistics really since the mid-1800s. Starting with European languages and trying to show what languages are related to what over there, but then very quickly by the early 20th century coming here to North America and looking at the profusion of native languages here on this continent and trying to figure out which of these languages are similar to other ones, how are they related, which ones are different, which ones are the same. And Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian have been long researched from this perspective. And there's been interesting and very, at times, controversial opinions about where these languages fit or don't fit in terms of what they might be related to. What's really interesting, one of the many, many things that's really interesting for a linguist being in Southeast Alaska, is not just that we have three languages, but that we have three such distinct and different, radically different languages. One of the things that people often point out is that if we look at Tlingit culture, Haida culture, Tsimshian culture, there's many, many similarities, right? If in terms of culture, the way that food people eat and the houses people live in, and then social structures of clans and so forth. There's a lot that's very, very similar. There are definitely differences, but there are many, many similarities. But the one area that really sticks out as being the most distinct aspect of culture among all three groups is the language. The native those three languages are, at least on the surface, are as different as any three languages you could pick on the face of the earth. You pick Chinese, and you pick Swahili, and you pick French. They are just as different from each other as Tlingit is from Haida is from Tsimshian. So I gave you there on the second page, since we're going with the number theme, the numbers 1 through 10 in all three languages. And even if you've never seen those words written before, even if you have no idea how to pronounce them, you can look across and to see, not really seeing a whole lot of similarity, right? These are pretty different looking words, right? Very, very much more like that second box on the first page, the Portuguese, Hungarian, Hebrew, Cantonese, and Greenlandic, right? It's much more like that, and not like Tongan and Samoan and Maori, right? So when we see that, and we could, like I said, we could do that with body part terms, we could do that with animal names, we could do that with verbs of motion. Pick a theme, pick a topic, and look at the vocabulary across the three languages, and you're not going to find many similarities at all. So, at the very least, that tells us these three languages are probably not closely related. It's possible that they have a distant ancestor way, way back in the past, and that it's been such a long time since that common ancestor was around that the languages have changed so much that they no longer resemble each other. That's one possibility. But certainly just looking at the evidence that we have, it doesn't look very likely. Now, many people will point out that there are, in fact, words in Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian that are, in fact, very similar. But almost all of these, if we look at them, almost all of these refer to items of acculturation, things that were newly introduced into Southeast Alaska within the past few hundred years. And almost all of those terms come directly from Chinook jargon, which was the trade language spoken up and down the coast. So you'll find, in fact, not just Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian have these similar sounding words, but all the way down the coast, all the way down even into Oregon, you'll find languages that have the same words for cat and liquor and pig and cow and so forth. So that's a good case where we see it's a case of borrowing, right? So the fact that the word for cat is almost identical in the three languages is not evidence that 50,000 years ago there was a common ancestor language and this was the word for cat 50,000 years ago. It's evidence that the word for cat is a new word. There was no need for the word for cat beforehand, and that it has been an introduced term very recently within the past couple hundred years. So we see the examples there for cat and liquor, pig and cow, and there's definitely more of those. But so if you come across words, if you happen to be studying two of these languages, or you happen to speak one and you happen to hear somebody speaking the other one, and you think you recognize a word in the other language, chances are it's a word from Chinook jargon. It's not an original Tlingit word or an original Haida word. It's most likely a borrowed term. So with that sort of background, I want to turn to what it is we know, or what we think we know. Again, just from a linguistic perspective here. There's obviously many other perspectives on all of this. But I'm here speaking just from the linguistic perspective. What it is that we know or believe to varying degrees about each of these three languages. If we can't say that they form their own little family and that they all fit together, then where do they fit? So we'll start with Tsimshian, because that's actually, in some ways, the clearest of the three in terms of what we know. So Tsimshian, what most of us call the Tsimshian language, in linguists refer to it as Coast Tsimshian, and speakers call it Tsimalgich or Shimalgich, depending on which side of the border they're on. And it belongs to a very small language family called Tsimshianic that has 4 languages in it. So you see the little table there. So Tsimshianic is the name of the language family. It has 2 branches, just like a family would have 2 branches. One branch is the Tsimshian branch, and the other is the Naskit-Ksan branch. In the Tsimshian branch, you have two Tsimshian languages. There's the one that most of us are familiar with, Coast Tsimshian, spoken in Metlakatla and over the border in the Tsimshian communities in British Columbia. And then there's Southern Tsimshian, which is now down to maybe 1 or 2 speakers remaining, and it's spoken at the very southern edge of Tsimshian territory. And it's distinct enough to merit being called a separate language. It has a different pronunciation system, different sound system. Some of the grammar is a little bit different, and it's has enough characteristics that warrant it being called a separate language. In the other branch of the family, we have Nishka and Gitxsan. This is an interesting case where, from a linguist perspective, if I was sitting here with just my linguist hat on, I would say Nishka and Gitxsan, that's the same language, right? There's very little difference in pronunciation. There's a couple of words that are different, But really, it's no more than somebody from California and somebody from Texas. Yeah, you can tell that where somebody's from, but they're speaking the same language. They understand each other perfectly well. So from a linguist perspective, looking just at the linguistic evidence, we would say, well, Nisga'a and Gitxsan are one language. But if you ask the Nisga'a and you ask the Gitxsan whether they speak the same language or not, the answer is no. Because not so much based on the linguistic side of things, but based on the cultural and political and social side of things. So that Nisga'a speakers, the Nisga'a nation and the Gitxsan nation, identify culturally and politically and socially as separate entities. Related, friendly separate entities, but clearly separate entities. And so from their perspective, we are separate entities and we each have our own language. And the fact that my language happens to be very similar to your language, that's interesting and nice, but that doesn't mean that there's only one language. We have our language, you have your language. And so from that social perspective, it counts as two different languages. Nisga'a but all four of them are quite similar to one another. So Nisga'a speakers say they have not too much trouble understanding Coast Tsimshian. Many Tsimshian speakers, the Samalgic speakers, say they don't really have too much trouble understanding Nisga'a. Give them a little time, a little bit of exposure. They can understand each other pretty okay. So that much we know. That one, we're pretty sure that those four languages are nice and closely related. But then the question is, well, is that little group of four languages, where does it fit? Does it belong with anybody else? And that's where we get some interesting and divergent opinions. So probably the most mainstream opinion among linguists about where Tsimshianic fits is that it forms a branch of a language family that's called Punition, which is where the other languages are found down in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Northern California. So Tsimshianic has definitely some similarities to these languages down there, both in terms of its the sounds that it has, the way its words are structured, its sentence patterns. There's some definite similarities. There are major differences, but there are some similarities, enough to make us think that, okay, perhaps far back in time, these languages are related. Tsimshianic would be what we call an outlier in the family, because if you look at it, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Northern California, it's all roughly a contiguous chunk of land where those languages are spoken. And then Tsimshian is way up the coast in northern British Columbia and southern Alaska. So it's linking this very northern language with a group of languages that it's much, much further to the south. So again, not even looking at, well, what's the next closest language? So if you looked at if you had a language map of British Columbia, you'd see that there are many, many other languages in British Columbia that are physically closer to Tsimshian speakers. So you have Salish languages, you have Athabascan languages, you have several different families in there that are much closer than the Punition languages are in terms of geography. But when you look at the languages, you see that the Tsimshianic languages are much more similar to those Punition languages than they are to anything that's around them in their current location. So not all linguists actually believe in the Punition language family. It itself is kind of a contentious point. But the people who believe in Punition, most of them believe also that Tsimshianic is probably part of Punition. So if you buy one, you kind of buy the other as well. As far as what languages are in Punition that you might know of, many people put Chinook in there, not Chinook jargon, but the actual Chinook language. Nez Perce, Klamath, Modoc, and other languages from that region. So that's sort of the mainstream opinion at this point. But there's another opinion out there, and it actually comes from John Asher Dunn, who's written a grammar of Tsimshian. He's studied it for many years. He's written a dictionary that we co-published here at Sealaska Heritage. and he is really one of the leading scholars on Tsimshian. And he has a different approach. He says that he believes that Tsimshian is not related to any other Native American language. It's not related to any other languages on this continent, but is in fact related to the Indo-European language family, which is English and French and German and Russian and Spanish and Greek and all these languages in Europe, plus Hindi and Farsi, languages in India and the Middle East. And this may seem a little far-fetched, but he's not just laying it out there as a wild claim. He's a guy who's studied the language, and he's gone through and looked for exactly these types of similarities. He's done his homework. He knows how to do this, and he's gone through systematically looking for similarities from one language to the next, trying to see, can we find patterns? And so he wrote a paper in 2001 where he said that he had looked at about 20%, he'd taken just sort of 20% of his Tsimshian dictionary and said, okay, can I find patterns? Can I find these types of sound correspondences with what we know of would have been the ancestral language for Indo-European, the language that English and French and German and Russian and Hindi, that language from which they all descended. And because a lot of people have done a lot of work, so we have a pretty good idea of what that ancestral language, the Proto-Indo-European language, is like. And so he was taking that information, what we believe the Proto-Indo-European language to be like, and comparing it with what he knew from working on Tsimshian and Nishka. And out of that 20%, he found 150 roots, words, that he believes, based on his research, shows a link between Tsimshian and Indo-European. So that's nothing to sneeze at, right? I mean, 150 words is pretty significant. And if you extrapolate that out, right, if that's based on 20% of the vocabulary, if you multiply that by 5, it would be up to 750 words that would be similar if that same rate of similarity were to occur across the whole vocabulary. And that's very significant. If you believe what he has there, that's something that would grab anybody's attention. And what he believes, the way he explains it, because he admits, right, that this is not a common kind of opinion to have. He says that most likely what it is that there was a language spoken in northern BC, southern Alaska, that was a Punition language. It was related to the Punition family, and that people came from Asia, and people who were descendants of the Indo-European family, and they came and they merged with the folks who were already here, so that the grammar and a lot of the word structure maintained that sort of Punition feel, that part of the language stayed that way, but that a lot of the vocabulary was replaced with these Indo-European words. So the vocabulary of Tsimshian comes predominantly from Indo-European, but the word structure and the sentence patterns come from Punition. So that it's sort of like an ancient mix between the two. I think it's an interesting theory. And I'm certainly not an expert on Tsimshian, and I'm not even really an expert on historical linguistics per se. But it's something that is definitely, I think, worthy of further investigation when we see things like that. So that's the sort of the two hypotheses that are out there for Tsimshian. For Tlingit, we now are fairly confident that Tlingit belongs to what I like to call the AET family, which stands for Athabascan, Eyak, and Tlingit. So we got that table there at the bottom of the third page. So we have the Athabascan, Eyak, Tlingit family, which breaks into two branches. One is the Athabascan Eyak branch, and one is Tlingit. Then that branch breaks into Athabascan and Eyak. And then the Athabascan branch, which I would need a much bigger piece of paper, breaks into about 40 daughter languages. So there are Athabascan languages up in the interior in Alaska, so languages like Koyukon, Ahtna, Dena'ina. There's languages in the northern part of Canada, so you have Gwich'in, Beaver, Carrier down into British Columbia. On the coast in Oregon and Northern California, you have Athabascan languages such as Hupa. And then in the desert southwest, in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, you have Navajo and Apache and several others. So that's the Athabascan family. And that family has been well known for almost 100 years now. The similarities between Koyukon, Ahtna, Dena'ina, Hupa, Navajo, Apache, that's been clear to linguists for the last 100 years. But it was really only in the last 30 years, as work was done on EAC, that people were able to link EAC in with Athabascan. And then it was only once the work had been done on EAC that people were able to then link Tlingit in with Athabascan as well. So it's a very stepwise process that you have to kind of figure out the small family first, and then you can add, and then you can add, and then you can add. For a long time, researchers had a feeling that Tlingit must be related to Athabascan. It's similar, it just felt like that's where it fit. But it wasn't really until Michael Krauss had published his work on EAC that we had the information there, that missing piece of the puzzle that allowed people to link the languages together. So what this hypothesis would tell us, if we wanted to read into the history, would be that at some point in the past there was an ancestral Athabascan EAC Tlingit language. From that, the first people to split off from that would have been the ancestors of the modern Tlingit speakers. From that remaining group, the next group to branch off would have been the ancestors of the EAC. And then you have the rest of the Athabascan groups, which then splintered off into the northern groups up in central Alaska and the southern groups down in the southwest. Now, so that's been pretty well known or believed here for the last couple of decades. But just in the last year or so, a linguist by the name of Edward Haida from Western Washington has done a lot of work on a language called Ket in central Siberia. Ket has been what's for a long time believed to be a language isolate. It had no known relatives. It was just kind of sitting there in central Siberia. It was nothing like any of the other languages in central Siberia. And so he has done a lot of field work on that language, which has today only about 500 speakers. And he's put together quite a lot of work which shows that Ket and a few other languages that are in its little family called Yeniseian is in fact related to Athabascan, EAC, and Tlingit. That it's the next step up as we go further and further back, trying to find further, more distant ancestors. And they've given the name Dene Yeniseian to this ancestral language. From which all of them are believed to be descended. What's significant about this, not just because it shows some more possible cousins for Tlingit, but it's the first really well demonstrated sound linguistic work that demonstrates a link between a language family in the New World, here in North America, and a language family in the Old World, in this case in Central Siberia. People have been looking, aside from the fact that you have Yupik speakers on both sides of the border, but looking at actual language families, people for a long time have tried to look at say the Bering Strait theory, that if people have migrated out of Asia to North America, well then maybe there's got to be some sort of link between the languages on both sides of the border. And for the last century, people have put forth all sorts of ideas. But nobody had ever gotten to the point that Edward Haida has of really showing, yes, you can reconstruct the words, you can show all of these similarities in the word structure and the sentence patterns, that these really do fit together. So that is now the standard and has gotten a lot of support from the linguistic community as far as believing that this is now something that's been pretty well proven. Beyond that there's still ideas even looking further back or further afield from Yeniseian. So there are folks who are working on what's called the SinoDinay hypothesis, which would link Athabascan, Eyak, Tlingit, and Yeniseian with Sino-Tibetan languages, which includes Chinese, Tibetan, Burmese, and a lot of other languages, as well as what's called the Diné Caucasian hypothesis, which is not this kind of Caucasian, but the languages in the northern Caucasus, right there between sort of Russia and Syria, and trying to link some of those languages with Athabascan and Tlingit. And some folks have taken it as far as to say that Basque in Spain, Burushaski, which is spoken in Pakistan, and even ancient Sumerian are probably related to Athabascan and probably related to Tlingit. There's not so much great evidence for that at this point, but there are people who are trying to make those connections and trying to reach back that far to see how far they can push it. But for now, I think what most of us would say has been pretty well shown is this connection between Athabascan, Eyak, and Tlingit on the one hand, and these Yeniseian languages in central Siberia on the other. So that's sort of where Tlingit is, and that brings us to Haida. And Haida is the most puzzling case of the three. So for much of the 20th century, many researchers believed that, had this sense, it really was sort of a belief, it was kind of taken on faith, that Haida has to fit in with this Athabascan, Eyak, Tlingit family, that it's got to fit in somewhere with that family. It always sort of seemed like the kind of odd step cousin of the family. Nobody was quite sure where it fit in because it really didn't look like the other languages quite so much. But there was a sense, well, it's got to kind of fit in there. There's just these little clues that make us think that that's where it should go. And there is a ton of debate about this. You have some people who absolutely believe it as gospel, that this is absolutely true. Haida is definitely related to Tlingit and Athabascan. You have other people who say this is completely made up, it's based on nothing, and that Haida doesn't belong there. And the debate has gone back and forth now for a century and is completely unresolved. People who believed one way still believe the way they believed, and people who believe the other way have not changed their mind either. But what's interesting about the hypothesis, this Diné Yeniseian work that Edward Vaida has done, is that he believes, and then other folks who worked on this also believe, that it shows that if we link these Yeniseian languages with Athabascan, Eyak, and Tlingit, then there's no room for Haida. That if you try to wedge Haida into that family, this family, this Diné Yeniseian family, that it breaks the patterns, right? You don't find these nice correspondences of sounds. You don't find the same word building patterns. You don't find the same sentence patterns if you try to wedge Haida in there. So what Vaida's work showed is not just that Ket is related to Athabascan, Eyak, and Tlingit, sort of having that positive result, but it also had a negative result, in a sense, of saying that if Ket is related, then Haida is not related, because it just really doesn't fit. And so has persuaded some more people. That's sort of the first thing to really kind of move the debate on Haida at all recently. So more people now are saying, well, this work on Yeniseian seems really well done, and it really seems to point to Ket belonging with these languages, and if that means that Haida doesn't belong, then I guess it doesn't belong. So if that's the case, if Haida does not belong with Athabascan, Eyak, Tlingit, and Ket, then what we have is a language isolate. Right? So it means we have no known relatives for Haida. So there's no language in the world where we can make a little table like this and find similar words for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If we have Haida in that table, there's no other language in the world that's going to have similar words. There's no other language in the world that's going to have similar word building patterns. There's no other language in the world that's going to have similar sentence patterns. It's just an isolate. At times people wanted to call it orphan, but I don't like that term. So we say isolate, unique, special. So there's about 6,000 languages in the world, depending on how you count. There's lots of these Naskitsan situations around the world where is it one language or is it two, but 6,000 is a good enough round number. And of these, there's only about 40 isolates in the world. So 5,960 languages we've been able to figure out, okay, this language is related to this language. It's clear enough that we can show that it belongs to some family. But there's about 40 of them out there in the world that have stumped us, that we just don't know. We've tried. We've put a lot of effort into figuring out where these languages come from, but there's about 40 of them that we just can't find any relations for. So there's among the ones you might know of, there's Ainu, the indigenous folks of northern Japan. Lots and lots of theories about where they may have come from and what their language may be related to, but nothing conclusive, despite years and years of work. Gilyak, which is just a little bit north from there in eastern Siberia. Korean, big, millions and millions of speakers, national language, long, long written history. No real clear sense of what other languages it may be related to. Same with Japanese. No real sense, lots of ideas, but nothing really proven about what Japanese is related to. Here in North America, we have Kootenai, which is spoken in Montana and British Columbia, kind of right straddling the border. And Zuni, down in New Mexico, which just looks nothing at all like any other language in the Southwest. And people have tried, for instance, to link Zuni with Japanese, which I think was not quite a successful approach, but it shows that people are trying, right? Just because they're called isolates doesn't mean that people have stopped trying to link them with anything else. But there's these couple dozen languages out there in the world that are just puzzles, that no matter how smart we are with our being really systematic and going through all the vocabulary and going through the sentence patterns and looking at where these languages may have come from, we just don't have an answer. And so our answer, at least for now, is a linguistic isolate. It's possible that someday we will find a relative for Haida. It doesn't mean that there isn't one, it just means that we haven't found one. It's possible that it will be somewhere further south in the Americas. Maybe it's in Central America, maybe it's in South America, could be in the Amazon, who knows. Or it might be back in Asia, right, as we've seen for Ket. So there may be some other languages out there in Central Siberia that if we just actually got the dictionary of that language and got the dictionary of Haida, maybe that's what we need to see where the relationship is. But that work has not yet been done, so for the time being, Haida is considered a language isolate. So that is my very quick kind of tour through the three language families and sort of what we think we know now. And again, this is looking just at it, from a linguistic perspective. This is something that, there's obviously archaeological perspectives, there's anthropological perspectives, there's very importantly native perspectives on where did we come from, who are we related to, how did we get here, some of which may match up with what the linguists think they know and some of which may not. But they all form a piece of the puzzle. As we try to understand our prehistory as a species, as the human race, across all this time, across all these cultures, across all these great migrations and centuries of change, I think every one of these different viewpoints needs to be taken into consideration. So the linguistic viewpoint on where these languages came from is one part of the story, but it's not the whole part of the story. And that's what's exciting about doing this kind of research, is we can bring our little bit of piece of the puzzle to the table, and everyone else can bring their pieces of the puzzle to the table. The geneticists can bring their piece of the puzzle, the archaeologists and the native historians, and everyone, we can bring all of our pieces together and try to make them fit so we can try to see what we can figure out about our own history. And with that, I'll say Hawa and take any questions.